As you well know, we're doing a series on wisdom in a world that has lost it. We've talked about an introduction to wisdom, and again, all of these are being recorded and they're on the website, kenbo.org, which we're going to be changing soon, which I'm very happy about. I want to change it to reflections.org. I'd rather not my name be on there, because after all, it's Reflections Ministries, and my monthly teaching letter is called Reflections, so we're going to be making that change soon. And what is wisdom? How do we attain it? The skill and the art of living in such that every area of life is really under the dominion of the living God, so that each component of life then is such that you live in a manner whereby everything matters. There's no sacred secular dichotomy. Nothing's trivial. Everything matters because you are now recognizing the wisdom of pursuing Him and submitting everything to Him in the process of the day-by-day journey. We talked about Proverbs and gave a kind of a 30,000-foot overview of that. And then the book of Job, and the key to that book, as I see it, is learning the secret of obeying someone you can't understand. And you'll never understand even the fringe of his ways. You can take anything in the natural world, and it'll be more than enough. Anything. It could be a leaf. It could be a flower, it could be an insect, it could be a bird. It gets more and more rich, more complex as you go. It's more mysterious than anything we could have imagined. Ecclesiastes, and now, and then wisdom in the New Testament, and then living a life of truth, goodness, and beauty. So we're up to the wisdom psalms, and typical lists of wisdom psalms include these. Although, as I mentioned before, I think Psalm 90 could be included because it teaches us there, teach us to number our days that we may present to you a heart of wisdom. So the essential notion is the grasp of the brevity of the temporal arena, and the recognition that we are actually pilgrims, aliens, strangers, sojourners, wayfarers, that we are exiles, and the idea that we are in a soul-forming world. And remember as well, when I ask an audience sometimes, where are you in your deepest self? Even now, where are you in your very deepest self, your spiritual self? And you recognize that the deepest self is really seated with Him in the heavenly places in Christ Jesus. You're a spiritual being having this earthbound embodied experience. And so in this world then, we recognize that the wisest thing we can do is to treat things according to their true value, and that is to say then, treat the temporal as such, hold it with a loose grip, don't put your hope in it, but only put your hope in the living God and in His promises that flow from them. Because you may hope for various things, but the minute you put your hope in anything other than Him and His character, you're setting yourself up for great disappointment. So to treat the temporal as such, and the eternal as such, rather than what most people do is they zoom down so much in the temporal, the tangible, the measurable, the quantifiable, the visible, that they are so zoomed down to that realm that they regard the eternal as something they can put off for later. You see, they can maybe a little bit later when I'm older, when I then have to get serious about these things. But you see, the more you put off actually the more you dull yourself, you desensitize yourself to spiritual truth. So you want to be a man who then sees each day and seizes each day as something as a gift from God that you'll never get again. This day will either be squandered or invested, but you'll never have it again. So the concept then of the wisdom psalms, we've looked at now some of them, and I noticed, going back to my old Reflections teaching letter, that way back in 1991, I actually did a long series on various psalms, and 6 of them were wisdom psalms. We've already looked at Psalm 1 and 19. I want to look at 37 and 73. So when I go to that, this is what the old newsletter used to look like. So here's Psalm 37. And it had to do with laying hold of God's perspective. And I love this poem by Eugene Warren. Is it chance or dance moves the world? Now that's a brilliant question. And you immediately ask that question and you recognize those are the only options you've got, chance or dance, you see. Because nothing else will work, nothing else will serve in that. And you realize then, either God works all things according to the counsel of His will and His purposes, or He doesn't. Is the world blind and dumb, or bloom festal, a vain jest, or a holy feast? So this perspective on life is the most critical theme. This temporal versus the eternal. And as I say here, it'll determine the set of rules by which you play, and it will. It'll set the standards and character that you pursue, the source of your hope, and the difference between obedience and disobedience. You see here I had a little error right there in my old newsletter. It's always fun to see. And this Meditation on the Toolshed by C.S. Lewis is one of the illustrations I've given you before. It's the concept, really. Let me just get my little black screen here. This is my most important one. Sometimes I put that up so you're not looking up there. Because Lewis talks about how on a bright summer day, he goes into a woodshed and there's a chink in the side and there's a shaft of light with the particles floating around in it. You've all been in such a situation. And I remember as a kid, in Louisiana, I spent all my boyhood summers in Louisiana. And I remember going in, we had a woodshed there, and I went inside there, and something compelled me to close the door and just look in the darkness, but then there was this shaft and everything was floating around, and as a kid, I started going to it, and at the end, I looked along it rather than at it, you see. And as soon as I looked along it, everything changed. It was no longer something floating in the woodshed, it was actually the sun in the distance, and the sky, and the trees. So that one moment then makes all the difference. It has to do with your point of view, your perspective, and that always makes the critical difference between one orientation and another. So in this understanding then, you have to take the question about what point of view you're going to take. It's a wisdom psalm, and it's a carefully crafted acrostic psalm. Acrostic means that it begins, in this case, almost every other verse with each successive letter of the Hebrew alphabet. So there's a beautiful structure in the text itself that's really an illustration of wisdom in its own making, you see, and there's a richness about that. And like the book of Proverbs, it's a structural poem that invites us to take the long term. So if we take a look at this psalm, we see that we're not going to go through the entirety of it, it's a big one, but he then tells us not to fret, not to have this temporal perspective where there's an obvious reality of injustice in this world. Things are not as they were meant to be, and we know that. Instead, we're invited to do certain things to actually have a solution of embracing God's purposes is to trust in the Lord, to delight yourself in the Lord, to commit your way to the Lord, and to rest in the Lord. And these are ways of seeing, and by the way, that if that ought to, I would think, hopefully remind you of something, because we actually had one of the cards was doing just that. So Psalm 37, which I've taught in this group, and then talks about those four components and what they mean. So to trust in the Lord is to put your confidence and hope in the character and promises of God rather than anywhere else. Ultimately, your perspective then is going to be shaped by your view of God and the character that he brings, so that either you will judge your circumstances according to his unchanging character, or you're going to judge God's character according to your changing circumstances. And if it's the latter, then you're going to be in a spiritual roller coaster, as you know. So here, our call is to delight, to trust, to commit our way to him, and to wait for him, and to be still before him. And this is always a critical motif in this psalm. So as I was arguing then in this material then, it contrasts the pursuits and destinies of the wicked and the righteous, and it grants that in the short run, those who refuse to acknowledge God, they may prosper. So there's a lot of inequity in this world. So from the short point of view, it doesn't make a good deal of sense. And indeed, I quote from Ecclesiastes 8:11, because the sentence against an evil deed is not executed quickly, therefore the hearts of the sons of men among them are given fully to do evil. If you got away with it, let's see what more we can do. And it continues to go on. And people continue to suppose that they can actually prevail and actually become the autonomous agents of their own outcomes, their own destiny. And they pursue this. And this concept then is that God will not be mocked, because we live in a moral and spiritual realm. So the wisdom of this psalm, as I say, is to adopt a long run rather than a short-term perspective. And that always becomes the point of view of wisdom. Embracing God's point of view, embracing God's perspective on what wisdom looks like. And so we want to be people then who are not fretful, envious, angry, or anxious when evildoers get the upper hand. So I look around the world and its injustices today and the absurdities that I see now, which seem to be only being amplified in post-modernity. And it's more of an invitation than any other time to live in the eye of the hurricane, to use the metaphor I've been using all along. The idea of really finding God's place and his poise and peace and purpose so that we can live with a sense of clarity, hope, a sense of expectation that God's purposes will be accomplished. And I see the long term, and I'm part of a larger story than myself. I'm part of a story that has those 4 acts, if you recall. And so it began well with creation, then we have the fall, and then redemption, but we are anticipating the 4th act, where all shall be well. And so as I look in this way then, I can trust in the Lord and ultimately then delight myself in him, letting the nearness of God be my good. And that is something that we recognize is needful for us. That each day we have to decide who's in control, who determines really where the wellspring of life come from, and then to commit myself unreservedly, my plans, my dreams, my hopes, my desires. And because at the end, the only things that can really be yours are what you've freely given to God. So in the end, you'll be unable really to keep or hold on to anything that you held back from him. So then to be still and to wait for the Lord becomes a key theme in this. Waiting for God, not becoming impatient, anxious, and frustrated, but to trust his character. And this is the key for me. If we can trust his character, we can also trust his timing. And that to me comes, because to be perfectly frank with you, my habit is to run ahead of the Spirit. I get an idea, and then I try to make it happen in my timing, in my way. And I have to recognize that God gives me an insight, but it won't be fulfilled until he chooses to do that. Rather than me manipulating the process, it's needful for me to rest and trust and hope in him. So that becomes an important theme in this psalm. The other psalm that we go back to was Psalm 73. And Psalm 73 I talked about in this issue, going back a little bit further here. Let's see, January of 91, where the nearness of God is my good. And again, I'm not teaching through the whole psalm, but the concept here is that he had a crisis of faith. And what we see in Psalm 73 then, going to here, is Asaph's wrestling with God, because he starts off by making this affirmative statement about God's goodness to Israel, but he also honestly acknowledges that when he saw the prosperity of those who seemed to be rebelling against God, his eyes became envious, and he couldn't make any sense. It seems that there's no real benefit to serving God. What is the good? I've kept my hands clean. And so he sees the prosperity of the wicked. No, they don't seem to be in trouble. And many of these people then get away with it and actually flaunt that around because God doesn't seem to see. The image of their eye bulging from fatness, because fatness was actually associated with wealth. The imaginations of their heart run riot. And they speak from on high. They set their mouth against the heavens. Their tongue parades through the earth, because after all, it seems that there isn't anything that's opposing their plans. And so he describes he wrestles. Does God know? Is there knowledge? These are the wicked. Always at ease, they've increased in wealth. And then he says, surely in vain I've kept my heart pure and washed my hands. What good was it that I was worshiping God when it seems that there's this inequity, this injustice? And so he's wrestling with it, and he really was saying that my feet came near to slipping. When I pondered to understand it, it was troublesome in my sight. Then I came into the sanctuary of God, and I perceived their end. Verse 17 is the pivot of the psalm. It's at the point when he sees the sanctuary and recognizes the brevity of our earthbound sojourn and the eternity of what God's planning for us. The recognition that God's not mocked. People will not get away with murder or whatever forever. That is a moral and spiritual universe. And so from an eternal perspective then, it changed everything. And suddenly he began to realize that they are actually people in slippery places, and that they're going to be destroyed in a moment, like a dream when one awakes, when you will despise reform. So he says, my heart was embittered, I was senseless and ignorant like a beast, but now he says, I'm continually with you. So this understanding, and this is what we want to affirm as well, is that God is with us, and we're continually with him. And with your counsel, you're going to guide me, and afterward receive me to glory. He then asks this question, whom have I in heaven but you? And besides you, I desire nothing on earth. Now, I wish I could say that. Do you think you can say that? But would you want to say that? So that's really what it comes down to. What do you long for more than anything else? And if you cannot say it's him, and besides him nothing, then can you say, I want you more than anything else? And you start there. And so this concept then is to desire him, so that then if he gives us various goods or does not give us various goods, we depend upon him, because our promise and our hope and our reward is not in this world. We're aliens. We're not home yet. So that's why there'll be injustices, but we'll also realize, though, that we must desire him more than anything else. And then he says, as for me, the nearness of God is my good. So I sometimes now have that as a salutation. May the nearness of God be your good, you see. So that becomes then the animating factor that moves you in that direction. So contrary to the prosperity gospel, there's no assurance that obedience to God will lead to material or physical well-being. In the covenant theocratic condition with Israel, indeed there was the case when the people as a whole, as a theocracy, when they were obedient to God, then there would be material blessings that would be associated with that covenant community, and that their borders would expand, and that they would have these diseases, and moreover that they would prosper in the land. But disobedience would bring about that. But in the New Testament, there is no connection at all between whether a person's righteous and whether they will flourish in this world. In fact, there seems to be the fact that you're guaranteed that if those who desire to be godly in Christ Jesus will be persecuted, and blessed are those who are persecuted. So you're pretty well assured that actually obedience to God is a thing that may not lead to material well-being as we might define it, yet at the end of the day, it will lead to the better good, the greater good. So you're pursuing the things that will matter most. The futility of gaining the world for a few brief years, the most important thing you can ever hear is, what does he say? Well done, good and faithful servant. The most horrifying word you could ever possibly hear, depart from me, I never knew you. So the very same one is the one who will give the greatest and the worst word you can ever hear. Well done, depart from me. So you need to live then in light of the desire to hear the well done. And every day, if I really make that my desire, that would this be a day in which he would be pleased, you see. So the audience to whom you play will shape everything else. So you're pursuing that desire. And the difference between, again, hoping in and hoping for. It's perfectly fine to hope for various things, for healing, for a job, any number of things. It's good to pray for these things, but don't put your hope in them. Only put your hope in him, in his character, his unchanging character, and the promises that flow out of that unchanging character. That is what we are to put our hope in. So this becomes the focus of your heart then, and it'll direct you more than anything else. So that, as Jesus said, that which is highly esteemed among men is detestable in the sight of God. And that's a somewhat chilling word, because many people then, he's telling us, will give their lives in exchange for things that will let them down in the end. It's not enough. We were meant for more. And he doesn't want us to have ashes in our mouth at the end of the day. We may have all kinds of resources and possessions and positions and power, prestige, popularity, but none of these will sustain the aspirations of the human heart. I've shown you this chart on the numerous occasions but it is true that these things never really end in joy by themselves. The pursuit of these, first and foremost, will not lead to a good outcome. We are looking for something more than these things can provide. What we're looking for is actually the fruit of the Spirit. And so you will find that as the overflow of the pursuit of God more than anything else. So if I pursue Him more than anything else, then everything else is thrown in. Pursue the first things first, the second things are thrown in. But if you pursue the second things first, you'll miss out on not only the first things, but actually the treasure of the secondary. So given this idea then, I want to ask you these questions then. How does the long view versus the short view relate to wisdom? We've discussed this before. The overall long-term perspective rather than the short-term perspective, focusing on what is going to last, what will endure, what will matter in the end. Because if a man dies, will he live again? This question raised in Job makes all the difference in the world. If in this earth form, this soul-forming pilgrimage, if during this time, then we pursue the things that will matter and last, then we're doing well. And we want to be people then who take the long-term perspective and live in light of eternity, recognizing that that is the day that when I will see Him. So this is the very day, this day is all you've got, and live this day how? We've talked about this before, in light of that day, in light of the judgment seat of Christ. So if I reduce my calendar to 2 days effectively, this day, which is all I've got, and the day of Christ, when I will stand before Him and give an account, wouldn't it be wise for me to live as if I was going to see Him tonight? Or how do you know you won't? Wouldn't it be prudent for me to live then with that holy expectation, that desire, and the grace of actual aspiration for the things that matter most? The falsehood and the prosperity gospel. And so we can talk about that. And we've talked as well about the difference between hoping in and hoping for. So let's take a look at that. What are your thoughts? Any insights that you wanted to share from your table? Did you have a kind of an aha moment in any of these tables? No aha moments? Come on.
I got one.
Okay, well, this is good. We need that, all right?
I didn't understand this, but my table did.
Your table understood and they illuminated and enlightened you, did they?
That the last question there, hoping in and hoping for, the difference is that hoping in should have an exclamation point after it, and hoping for should have a question mark after it.
That's not bad, hoping in, yeah.
Is that about
Yeah,
right?
that's not bad, because that you will never, as long as you make sure that what you're hoping in is nothing other than God and His character, and His unchanging character, because as we well know, it is His character that really causes us to see that in this vacillating circumstances of life, you don't put your hope in those things, but you put your hope in what He's promised. And so He said, all shall be well, and He invites us to see that He is working all things to this consummation, that when we are with Him, we will be like Him. And again, we realize that His intention for us is for us to be fully conformed to His image. And that conformity is not only spiritual as it is now, where we're declared righteous, already we are called saints, already we are now seated with Him at the right hand of the Father in the heavenly places, so that we are indeed spiritual beings, but we're having this earthbound embodied experience. But we live with that greater clarity and understanding because we renew our minds with the Word, and the more we do that, then the more we are inclined to pursue what He claims is what life is about, rather than what the world claims it's about. And you're going to either be renewed by the Word, but that requires discipline, or you're going to be defined by the world, and that you don't have to do anything. To be defined by the world, do nothing at all. And we know it's going to define you by default. So how am I defined by the Word, shaped by the Word? And so by being shaped by the Word, by transforming and renewing my mind, then I anticipate those things that are going to last. So God's character and promises are such that they are unwavering, and that gives me a stable hope and an assurance. It's Hebrews 6 if we consider this. Just let me summon that up for you. because he talks about this hope that we have. And he speaks about this idea that by two unchangeable things in which it's impossible for God to lie, we who have taken refuge would have strong encouragement to take hold of the hope set before us. What is this hope? It's God himself. It's his unchanging character. In spite of the vacillating circumstances of life, we have an anchor of the soul. And so this vision then, this image is an anchor of a soul, a hope both sure and steadfast, one which enters within the veil. So Christ has already gone before us. So here, then, you are a spiritual being in this embodied condition in this world, so the soul-forming process. And ultimately, his intention is for us not only to be conformed to his image spiritually, but also in our soulish self, which is going to be brought into that context in which we are being prepared for the judgment seat of Christ, and we want to live in light of that so that we continue to move. So that our goal in this world, as you know, is to become more and more in your practice who you already are in your position, so that you are, again, a new being, but you're also a becomer, and you're becoming in who you are. But then the third component is even our physicality. This earth suit will be resurrected. Hard to imagine what that'll be like. Very difficult. But I know then that you will have a resurrected body, just like Christ's own resurrected body. So the more we learn about that, the more we learn about what our condition is going to be in the eternities. So then you have spirit, soul, body completely conformed to the image of God. That's of his Son. It's an astonishing thought. So anything that would deter me from that desire, that pursuit, will actually be against my own best interests. At the end, I've never, never, never regretted acts of obedience. And I can probably say you can agree, but I've always, always, always regretted acts of disobedience, maybe not initially, but always at the end. Recognize the bitter fruits of pursuing my course rather than his. So there are many times when we go through adversities that are designed, I think, to draw us back to himself. And the pains of life, the setbacks, are even there designed to encourage, empower, and equip us. Why is this happening, we ask, when the thing happens? I just got back from the team retreat with Reflections Ministries. We met in St. Simon's Island. One of my associates has a place there. His family owns a condo, actually a house there. And we rented a few places there, right there. Beautiful place. Left on Monday with Jake and got down to Stockbridge, Georgia, driving south on 75. And then there was a lot of construction on the road, and the lane I was in filled with all kinds of things. And apparently something got into my passenger front tire. Something, maybe a nail, I don't know, but the thing almost blew up. And before I knew it, I had the unpleasantness of having to go 4 lanes over to get out of the traffic, but I'm feeling this thing lumping along. So the thing looked like it had blown up by the time I got to the right side of the road. And we then had the privilege, instead of getting there at 4:30, we got there at 9:30. It's 5 hours. And then you wrestle with that. There's got to be a purpose for this. Did I say, is it chance or a dance? If it's a dance, then I have to realize that God redeems what he allows, and he's going to allow that for a purpose that I cannot fully construe. So two of my takeaways was, one, just the experiential reminder of what I already knew in my head, but it was this: I control nothing at all. Hold your plans with a loose grip. But secondly, to be grateful for the blessings that I have. I'm not accustomed to that, you see, and that the freedoms and so forth, at least if I can amplify that, how do I know what the real purposes were? Mysterious beyond understanding, yet he works them together and redeems what he allows in such a way that he can even use this if we respond, because it's not what happens to you, it's how you respond to what happens to you that defines you. And do you respond to him, or do you respond to the circumstances, you see? The setbacks, do you focus on that, or do you focus on the one who has allowed it for a purpose that we cannot yet embrace and understand? And that to me is an attitude that we need to embrace. We can't understand it. We want to, but we can't. But we can trust the one we can understand.